the metadata issue that we were discussing yesterday. We didn't have enough time to finish up talking about it, so we set up this one-off meeting to kind of close on that. So where we left off was, I think we came full circle on starting with metadata inside of the volume handle, deciding that we were going to remove it from volume handle and have it be a sibling, but that brought up the question of whether the metadata should be optional or required. And it sounds like there were use cases that Julian was mentioning where it seemed like having the metadata field as required would be very beneficial, and required meaning if the plugin chooses to return it, then the CO must provide it on subsequent controller publish and node publish calls. And this seems to me like an extension of the volume handle. If you have a piece of information that is required in addition to the ID on every single request, to me that seems like an extension of the ID. And what I wanted to do was see if we could break down the actual concrete cases where this would be useful, and see if we could come up with a mechanism, a better mechanism to handle those. If not, we can fall back to this. Julian, do you want to give any additional anything? Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wonder if I feel like the use cases where it's a hard requirement for the CO to pass metadata to the plugin are mostly around publish, right? So
yeah,
I do feel like if there are cases where it would be useful for the CO to be able to forget the metadata when we're doing things like getting volume info or deleting or unpublishing the volume, and just do those with ID. I think for the use cases that I'm aware of, that's like probably okay. What it would mean is that the plugin can't take its own internal representation of ID and stuff it in the metadata.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so for example, if the plugin gets an ID from its backing system, like AWS or something, and it wants to poke that into the metadata as the spec exists today, that's fine. If we take it out of the delete and unpublish use cases, then that becomes more difficult. But it's probably fine anyway. It just means that there's more of a requirement for plugins to become stateful. So I guess I see the hard requirement being around publish.
Okay.
You know,
that
if we want to take it out for unpublish and delete, then I guess I'm okay with that, if that's helpful.
Okay. So let's talk about publish then. Let's talk about what the concrete cases are that we would use this. I think the last one that we were discussing was the Ceph keyring. Do we want to elaborate on that some more, or some other concrete use case where this would be?
I think it's so in general, it's you can imagine it's either data that's coming into the create through the metadata in the request, or it's stuff that's coming into the controller plugin from the IaaS layer or whoever's doing the storage provider, right, at create time. And that could be the plugin creating credentials or receiving credentials from the user, one or the other. I think we have a mechanism for received credentials but we don't have a mechanism for created credentials. So in the case of like the Ceph example, where we need to make a key ring to lock down access to a cluster, that's generated credentials that need to somehow get to the node plugin. But it could also be for simple NFS cases, things like, non-sensitive arbitrary metadata, things like mount options. So somehow those have to get transmitted to the node plugin. And so I don't know if it makes sense to separate the sensitive from the not sensitive. Because even if we say, oh, there's a set of metadata, like even if we say, oh, we're going to separate out the sensitive metadata, I'm not sure that we have a comprehensive enough roster of all the things that could be sensitive in the credentials mechanism to cover all the potential use cases, right?
So I would definitely like to separate out sensitive information simply because we have to put in the spec that the CO must handle these differently. You can't handle it in the same way as non-sensitive data.
Well, except that, I mean, you can take a map and you can say, oh, this may or may not be sensitive, so treat it as though it's sensitive, right? Which is what we have today.
Well,
so just don't put it in your log and make sure you encrypt it, right?
If we have sensitive information and we're going to persist it, we want to persist it through our secret mechanism. And we don't want to throw non-sensitive information into there just because it's convenient. So for us, we want to be able to have a distinct, if there is sensitive data, we need to know that it is going to be sensitive and use it as such. So I'd like to have a distinct mechanism for create to return credentials if we need that. So then drilling down on that, I wondered, do we really need that? I was talking to some folks yesterday about the way Ceph works. And normally they were mentioning, and I'm not a Ceph expert, so I may be completely off base here, but they were saying you don't create the cluster when you do a create volume call. The cluster is set up out of band ahead of time, and the credentials are set up out of band. And then when the create volume call is created, credentials could be passed in there, but they wouldn't be necessarily returned on the create volume call. Is that completely wrong, or?
Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to dig into it a little bit more. But certainly we have analogous cases in for things like in Cloud Foundry for like our ECS plugin set, we spin up S3 buckets and then provision them for NFS because ECS supports that. And then we generate a user and make some credentials for that user and pass it out. So I suspect that this isn't an isolated use case. Now, I guess I'm a little bit nervous about making the assertion that the only kind of sensitive information is a credential. That seems incorrect to me. There are varying degrees of sensitivity, right? It's kind of a continuum of sensitivity. So for example, your name is somewhat sensitive in the scope of internet data. Your social security number is much more sensitive. It's still not a credential, or like your date of birth and your address, right? So this is
I think
a little bit
of
a rat hole, but
didn't want to put everything in one container. So even if it is a continuum, his principle of segregating sensitive from unsensitive makes sense. It's just an issue of, in a gray area, which one you pick. I do have one follow-up question, though, on your use case. And do you ever envision in something with these credentials where it would have to change? For example, if it were a password with a policy that says you change it every 30 days, do you see that happening in your use case? And if so, which side would be the first one to be aware of the change? The CO, side or the storage provider side.
Yeah, I think that's a use case that is completely not covered by the spec today, right? So even if you imagine, oh, we're not going to pass these credentials back and forth, we don't have any way for the CO to know that the credential changed and the mount needs to be remounted.
So the way that credentials are spec'd out today, it is the responsibility of a cluster administrator or a user ultimately to point to a set of credentials, and those will be used for create calls, publish calls, and therefore it's essentially out of band from this. The SP doesn't provide the credentials. It comes from somewhere else. It could be out of band from a cluster administrator or user could talk directly to the service provider to initially get those, but they're all just passed in once they're available. They're assumed to be available through some external mechanism. The availability isn't through CSI today. It sounds like what you're saying is that there is a need for some subset of use cases to be able to return secrets on the create volume call. That could be useful. And if that's the case, we can consider a field to return credentials on the create volume response, but then we need to talk about how exactly would that be used? What does it mean for the CO? Is the CO required to pass it on all subsequent requests? And then we can, once we have that figured out, we can revisit the non-sensitive aspect of this. But do you agree that it's worth breaking into two?
I think we're losing you.
No, I still heard it. I heard it perfectly.
Oh yeah, sorry, Saad, you dropped on my connection, so
Okay.
I think you were asking a question.
So my question is, do you agree that we should break sensitive information from non-sensitive information and handle those as distinct cases and address them separately in the API?
I'm okay if we do that. I guess I am. Again, I would repeat my concern, though, that if we're saying we're going to separate out sensitive information and make the assumption that the only kind of sensitive information we can handle is credentials, then I think we might be.
I don't think that has to be stipulated.
Adding a layer of complexity to the spec and removing the utility. So. Yeah, because I think there could be, like, you could imagine even the existence of a mount point being deemed to be somewhat sensitive. So we prefer that not show up in logs and that it be somewhat obfuscated, right? So,
So I'm
so
just
I
a
think the way
little.
that the spec is today, or the way we started, because this has been in the spec, this metadata has been in the spec since pretty much the beginning. You know, I made the case for this like the first meeting we had, and as it stands today, we just have this glob of data, and we say, well, don't log this and assume that it's might have some secrets in it and treat it accordingly, and it's opaque to the CO. As soon as we start parsing it out, then we're involving the CO in, it's kind of all of a sudden the CO's got multiple fields. So I'm okay if we do that. I'm less okay if we say, oh, the only kind of sensitive thing we handle is credential sets of a known set of classes, right? Because then that's going to be us just like shoehorning all kinds of random data into something that we call a password just for the sake of having a place to put it.
I don't think that mechanism has to strictly be for credentials. We can make it generic enough that it's secret information, that a way to share secret information between the SP and the CO. Go ahead, Luis.
This is what Steve brought up, and I think it's a great point, which I was trying to bring up yesterday, where metadata is mutable. And if that content, if we keep going on with the use case where that content is going to be used for credentials, and that content is not mutable, then I don't think it's usable.
Well, I guess that's an interesting assertion to me, because right now in the spec, I don't see that we have any mechanism for it to mutate. Like, what is the circumstance under which it would change? It's passed out by create, returned by list.
No, but not looking at the spec. Let's say if the spec needs to change, it needs to change. But I'm just saying that if we're talking about credentials to access and mount a specific volume, let's say CIFS, right? And those credentials change because the password changed of that user. Where are those credentials being stored to be able to access that data? It's just an open question.
Right. So if they're generated by the storage provider, currently today we don't have a way for them to change, right?
So even the credential case, let's take a step back and just look at the credential case real quick and see if it even makes sense. So for the credential case, the argument is that when the create volume is called, along with the provisioning of the volume, some sort of credential information is going to be returned. That information must be passed in on subsequent request in order to access that volume. The assumption there is that if access to these volumes is going to be sensitive, I guess creation of these volumes should be access controlled as well, which means credentials should be passed in on the create volume request. So essentially what's happening is the set of credentials that are passed in on the create volume request are then mapped internally to another set of credentials, and those credentials are being returned to the CO to pass in the future. If the same set of credentials that are passed in on the create call can be passed in on subsequent attach or publish calls, would that not be sufficient to, I mean, essentially what it would mean is that this storage provider would have to maintain its internal mapping, I guess, which comes back to the original issue of requiring these plugins to maintain state.
Hi, can't this information be pulled back from the storage provider when they need it by the plugin?
What do you mean, Chakri?
So when you create a volume, you're passing the information back to the CO, right? From the storage provider. Let's say if you need that information during a node publish or attach, right? The plugin can't it actually use the same credentials which you used to create?
Yeah, that's what I was proposing.
To get the secrets back, right? Whatever the information is required, and subsequently do the mount inside itself.
I was proposing that, but then when I thought about it out loud, the problem with that is essentially it would require the storage plugin to maintain some sort of internal persistent mapping between the external credentials and its internal.
Storage provider should always have the mapping, right, irrespective of it.
Right.
All the details. You cannot. Storage provider has to have some state. It cannot do without any state, right?
Yeah, if it's going to do auth and authorization, then it kind of needs to be able to handle those credentials.
Yep.
Yeah, at some point, somewhere, you need an IDP that's going to validate your credentials for you. So sure, I think where this gets a little sticky is that, you know, if we're saying that we're going to manage the creation of resources externally, and those things might change, I don't think the spec really handles that case, right? Just in general.
Maybe another reason to just pull it all out.
Actually, that's true even for today Linux, right? Let's say if I have a CIFS partition and I mounted it and suddenly I went ahead and changed my password. What is expected?
Yeah.
So some of it again depends, but most of them actually keep the mount alive till you actually go ahead and retry to unmount and remount. Only then it will fail.
Depends on the system.
Exactly, yeah. But most of them do it that way, right? So
yeah, I wouldn't. Yeah, but if most, then not all, then we cannot depend on that.
No, that's not the point, right? The point is, it's exactly the same behavior we have with Linux. So why do you want to enforce something? Nobody can do anything about it even today.
Oh, well, okay. So let me go back a little bit and say that the whole point of Kubernetes is that containers move from place to place all the time, right? If you may be evicted from one location to another location without you knowing. So, and then the mount point just follows that location. The problem is when it follows that location to a new location that has more space and more memory, now you cannot mount.
No, but that will come when you're actually doing the mount, you're actually passing in the credentials in the mount. I think the case we are talking about is when somebody changes those credentials, how do you pass that to the backend, right? Dynamically.
That's
So
that's
far,
exactly what I'm saying too.
the answer to in our spec has been it happens out of band. We don't assume that the credentials are passed through the interface. The credentials are assumed to come from external to the interface.
Exactly, yeah.
And that has been hugely simplifying for us. We've been able to avoid all these problems because of that. If we start to try to encode these into the interface, it's going to complicate it a lot, I agree. I would really prefer not to do that, at least not for the initial implementation. If we encounter volume plugins where it's an absolute necessity, then we can consider extending the interface to add this mechanism. But I don't think it should, I don't think we need it yet. I don't know if there's going to, I don't know if any volume plugin that we have currently in Kubernetes that we would port over to CSI, which we wouldn't be able to do without it.
So then I would suggest that you keep it simple for now and not have
So actually, I think to clarify, right, again, Julian, correct me if I'm wrong. There are two cases, right? One is user wants to mount it and you provide secrets at the moment.
There's an echo coming in. It's hard to hear.
Ardalan, can you mute?
Oh, sorry.
So there are two cases, right? In one case, actually, user provides the secrets to mount or attach. And the second use case is you get some of that information in the create call. That means that you don't know something like a self keyring or something which you can actually use for subsequent mount calls or attach calls. And that information is written part of the create. And for those kind of plugins, will it be possible for the plugin implementation to query the backend storage or use some out of band way to get those keyrings for now? And since it's the 0.1,
so I guess this is the point I've been making over and over again. Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Like we could tear this out, and we could say every node plugin needs to go find this from a backing store, and the result is, yeah, you can still do stuff, but it means that every plugin, even incredibly simple node plugins that all they do is a kernel mount with some options, is going to turn into a plugin that requires a database connection, right? And then now it needs network access to that database connection in whatever topology you're having. It needs.
Wait. Why this? We're conflating two different things.
That is case one, right?
I'm just saying, like, if you tear out metadata completely, right?
No, we're not talking. Well, okay, go ahead.
I think this was the question.
Yeah,
correct me if I'm answering the wrong question. Then
no, that's right. But I think the conclusion I disagree with. I don't think that you're going to, for simple volume plugins that just require things like mount information, I don't think it would be impossible. The only answer would be to have some sort of backplane connection because.
Well, so either you have a backplane connection, or you're packing all this stuff into the ID, in a hash, right?
Which I would argue,
right? But
is the correct.
From my perspective, from my perspective, I think that's terrible because it means you're overloading the ID and turning it into a hash, and
if the information is
potentially your ID gets pretty big, and if anything about.
Maybe we should change the name of ID to token, and everybody will be happy.
That's another can of worms.
So I mean, I don't know. We've.
And by the way, if you commingle this metadata and then hash it and claim it's the ID, and the metadata is mutable, that doesn't work because your ID wouldn't be static.
Oh, yeah. You cannot make it mutable. Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's the key. Is if this data is immutable, it is essentially an ID, right? Like. The only thing that must be immutable, everything that you need to be able to access a particular volume and operate on it that is immutable is essentially an ID. If it is...
you can't be right. Mutability and versus uniqueness are totally two different things, right?
Yeah, but have we decided that we can live without mutability? Because if we need mutability, then our choice, I think we have to fork the storage of that part of it from the ID. We don't have a
So we don't have a modified volume today. There's no way for it to mutate.
So actually, can I add something? So let's say that if I call create volume 2 times, is the expectation that the fields are going to be returned to be exactly the same? Even though we say that the CO cannot mutate, there is no way to enforce that the storage provider won't mutate the fields.
Well, it's supposed to be idempotent.
Sorry.
Right? It's supposed to be idempotent, so you shouldn't get back different results.
No, the metadata can, right?
So that's calling create volume with the same name, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So if you call create volume with all the same stuff multiple times, you're supposed to get back the same result every time, no matter whether
The metadata,
whether it created anything or not, right? So that I think is kind of, to me, in the spec as it exists today, there is no way for this stuff to mutate. Now but I think we may want to have a modified volume or an update volume at some point in the future. We don't have that use case today, but I can imagine how we might,
You know what I'd like to see in the future? This is future. It's have the CSI driver be bidirectional. The CSI driver can close the CO to say, like KVDB get and set. And then that, I mean, from my point of view, that makes it so that the system CO provides a metadata location for your key, whatever that is. And I think that would solve many of the issues that we would hit in the future, right? And make everything mutable, and then the driver takes care of that, and so on.
But server-server communication is always going to be very tricky, right?
No, the gRPC supports that.
gRPC supports it, but having encoding that logic is going to be... There are two ways. Whether you can pass the data back and forth is one thing, and if you want two of both the client and server to act, that means you're kind of going into a server-server model.
No. I mean, the gRPC, you make a call, and I want to get this key or store this key, you go back to something, and it serves that data for you, and then you come and get it, and you do whatever you want, and you resolve the call that you got in the first place. And there's no master here. It is a service provided by the CO.
So you're basically turning a CO into a database.
Yes, I'm just trying to provide this ability for the CO to do this. Instead of doing it in every call, that the CO, this is what we're asking here anyway, but instead of putting it in the volume handle, we're saying that the CO will provide this as a service.
Well, we're not doing it anyway because we don't support mutability. And what you're asking for is for a CO to be a database that supports mutable data. Right?
Sorry, Jim.
This is future stuff. I only said future. This is not in this conversation.
So will it help if we take two plugins, or at least the plugins in question, and try to work out the workflow? And
yeah, I mean, that's what I would love to see is let's talk about concretes. Right now, I think a lot of this conversation is centered on hypotheticals. Yeah. That's why I keep snapping to the Ceph keyring example, because I haven't heard any other concrete use case. I think the other concrete use case I heard was mount options for NFS. Let's talk through those. Okay. If there's others, we can talk through those as well and see if there's a good place to put them.
So I think those are pretty straightforward, right? I mean, it's just if you take the simple example of external available mount points out there in the world, and we have some NFS plugin that goes and mounts those things into your workload, right? So that's going to be just normal NFS mount options, and there's a handful of them. That isn't a ton of data, but it's host mount point, which could be arbitrarily long. Credentials. I guess you could potentially have Kerberos key tab type stuff in there, but that I think is almost completely unworkable in a cloud environment. So we did some experimentation with Kerberos authentication in NFS4 and kind of dead-ended on it. So I don't know if anybody here has more concrete experience with Kerberos. So probably it's not going to be those things. So that's that stuff, and none of it I think is in the base use case is all that sensitive. I mean, apart from the mount point itself, which
So will that be part
I
of
might think.
will that be part of the volume info, or you want it to be part of the volume ID? Because volume info also has a map of string, which you can use for some of this information, right? Or it can be sourced from external secrets. Two ways.
So if we assume that we're not, the simple implementation is the node plugin just gets a node publish volume request, right? And it gets whatever it gets as part of that request, and it does a kernel mount, right? So this is the case where the node plugin is like, 50 lines of code, right? So having the ability to pass that information in just gives us the ability to make a simple implementation. And I think Saad's point is, well, you could just make this into a hash and stuff it into the ID, and that should be good enough. I guess I question whether or not we really want to do that, because that hash is going to end up in everybody's log file, right? It means that every piece of information we want to pass to the node plugin has to end up in some big encoded string and jammed into an ID. And hash is probably the wrong word, because it isn't a hash, right? It's the encoded, all of the data encoded somehow.
Right. And I think the one use case that doesn't fit that is the credentialed information, because one, it's sensitive, two, it could be very large. And the other case that doesn't fit it is information that should be mutable. All information that's non-sensitive and immutable, you should put into the ID, encode into the ID, because that is the information that is required to be able to operate on this volume.
Right. So, yeah. So I guess then the only case, like, so if we're saying we're going to tear the metadata out of the spec and just have a string for the ID, then the only thing, and what you just said, we accept as true, then the only problem we have is the case where the ID originates from the controller plugin.
I have one question on this one. So what is the source of this information, the mount options and the secret? Who is the source? Is it the CO or is it the plugin?
So the user is going to pass those things in. Well, it could be either, right? The plugin might have some standard set of stuff. The controller plugin might have some standard set of stuff, or it might get those from some database that it has for whatever.
Yeah.
Or but more likely it's coming from the user in the inputs to node create volume, or controller create volume, right?
So
that request has a hash in it where these options would go.
So in that case, do you want it to be part of the volume ID? Because like this is information which is coming from CO, and the volume ID is kind of returned from the plugin, right? Why do you want it to be part of the volume ID? Because when CO already knows it and passes it back.
Well, we don't. I don't think we have any way to pass arbitrary metadata to the node publish volume, right? Those go into the create. So that's where the CO tells the plugin what this volume is like.
But create need not be supported by some plugins, right?
Is that right?
That's true. Yeah, create is an optional call, right?
Yeah, which to be honest, I never really thought that was a great idea. but because in the case where you can't create stuff, you still need to describe it. So
Yes.
I always sort of felt like, well, the flow that makes sense to me is we always call create, and that's what converts metadata that the CO understands into metadata that the plugin understands. If you don't call create, then that means the CO has to come up with a volume ID somehow, and in that case, it's coming out of a list, right? I mean, that's the only way to do it.
Yeah, it gets really hard because it either comes out of list, which is also optional, or you're requiring your end user to somehow understand the encoding that the plugin needs so that it can generate one of these encoded hashed IDs, which gets kind of awful, I think.
Right.
Guys, a quick question. This is confusion. The spec on GitHub, it says it's a must on create volume. Are we talking about a different version of the spec or somewhere else?
Yeah, I think we decided it was a must for this specific reason, right? Like even if you're
I thought initially the same actually, but in the last few CSI meeting calls, I was told multiple times, like for NFS and something, we don't need to do a create call. So yeah,
So
I didn't check that.
There's a capability, create, delete. I think it's called create, delete, or something like that, that a controller can advertise.
And the list.
So,
Yeah, it is. So if you look in the capabilities tell you which things are optional. And so there's a create, delete volume, and there's a publish, unpublish volume, like James was saying. So create is optional for that NFS case.
So given that, right, the source of this information, sorry, Luis, go ahead.
Oh, no, just saying, okay, thank you. Because on the call itself, it says must. When I have to, it's a must if you have create, delete. I get it. Thank you.
So given that if the source of information is actually the CO, and the ID is getting from the plugin, which is that means the source of that ID is actually the plugin. So if we have a way for us to pass this metadata from the CO to the published volume, I think that will solve most of these issues, right?
Yeah, but it means that this thing that was opaque to the CO all of a sudden has to become not opaque, right? How is the CO, like I write an arbitrary plugin and I say, I need these 5 fields.
There are 2 sources of information, right? One is the CO, which we said that user is the one which is putting the information. And that goes to the CO. CO has it in the database. The source of that information is the CO. And that source of information is what you need for the publish and unpublished too, right? And that can be passed in the node and unpublished calls. And there is another source of information which can be passed by the plugin in the create call. That is ID. And that ID can be simple string, right? Because whatever the information it has to construct, it can construct from the information which is going to source from CO in the node publish call too.
Right. So this is, to me, kind of just another argument for separating metadata out, because if we're going to say that the plugin is going to advertise to the end user what format volume handles need to be in order to be usable in the case where you haven't called create, then saying, oh, well, you know, just put it in this structure and then JSON encode it and call it an ID seems to me to be terribly error prone.
So when you put it like that, it sounds like a terrible idea, but let's break down what you're going to be putting into that ID. It should not be sensitive credential information. If there's a need for that, we need to explore a new API to be able to, or an extension to the create response to be able to handle that. It should not be any information which is mutable, because if it is, then your ID is worthless. It should be, your ID should be immutable. It should be unique. And what that means is if there is information that you're going to require on subsequent publish calls, which you don't have a mechanism for the volume plugin to retrieve itself independent of anything else, then you must encode that information into the ID. It essentially, that is the purpose of your ID. The purpose of the ID is to have all the information that you need, all the connection information that is required for this volume encoded into that string, so that you don't need any other information in order to both uniquely identify and connect to this volume. And what is being proposed with metadata to me feels like you're taking that field and you're breaking it into two separate fields for convenience, but the CO doesn't care about that second field. It's not going to use it. So if you draw a diagram on how it's used, it's literally, usually there's information being passed either from user through the CO to the SP, or the SP to the CO, or the CO to the SP. But in this case, what metadata is doing is it's taking information from the SP and just putting it right back into the SP. The CO doesn't care about this information, and that just seems like a misuse of the interface to me. We're trying to jam in cases, hypothetical cases. It seems to me. That's why I keep wanting to focus on concretes. Which is
okay. So the concrete case. Go back to our simple NFS mounter plugin, right? We're going to say, yeah, we don't support create at all. So there is no more, you pass your stuff into the create call as metadata and the plugin cooks it for you.
Yep.
Now we're saying, you know what, the plugin expects an ID.
Yep.
And so what that means is we're going to end up with IDs that look like essentially entire mount specs, delimited somehow in a specific format. And we're going to say, hey, the plugin thinks that the CO believes that it knows which of these things point to the same resource, right?
The CO doesn't have to.
That sounds wrong to me. That there's no create volume where that's the only location where you can create a handle. There needs to be maybe another location or some other call X that a handle is created, and then with that handle you create a volume with it, and then you create your publish.
Luis, we've considered a get volume info call. We haven't gotten to that yet, but even without that, essentially what it comes down to is the CO doesn't itself need to be aware. It's the end user or the cluster administrator who has to provide this ID. And so they have to, if they're directly referencing one of these volumes, that means it's pre-provisioned. They need to know what the information is that is going to be required by this volume plugin and how it's encoded and create that string.
Well, how do you unmount it then?
What's that?
How do you unmount it then?
How do you unmount it? You need to be able to reference what you're unmounting.
Yeah.
So for an NFS volume, you're going to have to know what the IP address is and what the share is, and then be able to reference that through whatever encoding that particular NFS plugin uses.
So I'd like to bring up a concern, and maybe it's not really a high priority, but it's something I think about when working with systems like this. And so if I'm logging an ID and that ID is some encoded hash of like a bunch of information, and let's say it's 200 bytes long, if I'm digging through system logs trying to figure out what's going on, I've got IDs that the plugin's generating, logging, and I've got IDs that the CO is logging from volumes, and each of these IDs is like 200 bytes long. It's not very convenient from a debugging perspective. Like, it's not very usable. I mean, you could argue that, whatever, it's just in a log file, and, maybe you could just grep for a prefix of whatever that ID is. But it seems to me like one advantage of having something that we call an ID that we initially said was going to be useful for logging and debugging was that it would be, relatively short. I don't know that we actually picked a size or something, but in my mind, an ID probably wasn't like 200 bytes or 512 bytes, right? Like, an ID would be relatively short in the sense that it would be useful for tracing or debugging or logging. And so as soon as we start down the path of, this ID could be, really long because we're just basically encoding whatever the hash is into some ID string. It just seems to me to become a little less usable for those kind of scenarios. So again, I don't know if that's a high priority for anybody else, but it's just something that I think about.
It would be nice to have, but what we need to keep in mind is the API itself needs a way to be able to identify a volume. And so you need to put this information somewhere. Now, if we want to say that we want to have a pretty name that we can throw into the logs, and that string can be only a certain length, and that length is too small to be able to encode all the information required to identify the volume, now that string is no longer an ID, it's a pretty name. It's not an identifier for that volume. It's a potentially a non-unique alias at best.
So actually, can we use a concrete example? Let's say that I have a server foo, and I have my export as a my export, and this is the volume I want to actually see mounted for my workload, right?
Yep.
So what will be the expectation of ID over here? What will be the user input? Let's say that take up a Kubernetes case where you have a spec, or a Docker case, right? Where you have a spec where you specify this mount point. From that point, let's say I don't have a create call. Create call will never be called. Will a publish call will be called? If a publish is called, what will be the arguments be?
So if we eliminate all of metadata and we say a ID can be a maximum of 1 megabyte and it must contain all the mutable information required to identify a volume, then this ID must contain the information about the export and the information about the server that's exposing it in a format that is defined by the storage plugin, and then that must be passed in on subsequent requests.
So the first call will be, okay, get volume info or get volume, and that get volume will pass all these volume, and then that will pass a volume ID, which will be used for subsequent calls.
Yes.
So that means that we are actually already taking in a CO sourced information, and we are giving it to the plugin, and we are asking to plugin to keep a context of it and convert into an ID for us.
So that's assuming that we actually implement get volume info. The way that it's currently spec'd, we don't have get volume info. So for the dynamic provisioning flow, you go through create volume, and that creates a volume and returns the ID to you. In the pre-provision case where you have a volume that exists and you're going to bypass create volume, we don't currently have a get volume info. So the way that you would have to do it is your end user, your cluster administrator, somebody who's pre-provisioning these, needs to essentially construct this ID somehow.
Or the plugin implements create to just do that mapping, right?
Sure.
I mean, we essentially have get volume info. We just call it create volume, right?
Yep.
I mean, if the plugin is standing in for connecting to existing resources, there's no reason you can't use create for that.
Yeah.
So in this case, we have a CO source options, which we passed it to the plugin, and plugin massaged it and gave it back to the CO. So why do we need the plugin to massage it back and give it back to the CO?
Well, we don't. I mean, it's either that or essentially the CO is too stupid to come up with an ID or too ignorant because it doesn't know anything about the plugin. So that means the plugin has to advertise to the end user, hey, here's what my IDs look like. So if you want to make one of your own, formatted in thus and such way. And for that kind of plugin that's capable of doing that, it should be able to understand, like, oh, I know that this is this is essentially a comma delimited NFS mount point and a bunch of options. So I'm gonna pull that in. But I think that to James's point, that kind of input is going to look really ugly in the logs, right? Because all of the same delimiters you're going to use to define your options in a single string.
It is going to look ugly, but that's what an ID is. If we want to, for the sake of logging, add another field that we call pretty name or something like that, that is optional, I'd be okay with that. I think it's not necessary, but if that's what people want, I'd be okay with that.
I have a question. So it's not a question, more of a comment. Overloading of the meaning of ID can be abused. So is there a reason why, and forgive me because I've I'm just starting out. Is there a reason why we're overloading the meaning of ID and not considering it to be a simple string to identify the volume?
Yeah, it can be. We're just leaving it up to the volume plugin to decide that. There's going to be volume plugins that are going to take the simple string. So you can imagine the GCE PD case where you have a volume name, and that's going to be all the ID is. But there are going to be volume plugins. NFS is the classic case where to uniquely identify a particular volume, you need multiple, essentially, subfields. You need the IP address, you need the export, and potentially other information to be able to uniquely identify that particular volume. And so that's the tricky one. And how do you handle that?
Well, could we require the plugin to have a pseudo ID that's the same, no matter, not the same, but have the same format?
You could, but to Julian's point, that would require your plugin to be have some mechanism to persist state. So what Julian is arguing is that if instead of making the plugin's life more difficult by requiring them to have some sort of mapping to persist.
Yeah, but I think we're gonna the plugin's developer life is going to be chaotic anyway, because eventually, I think the responsibility of most of what we're talking about should be on the plugin side. Because I mean, there's no telling. There's no telling. I may want to implement a plugin however I want, targeting the same storage platform. So I think most of the responsibility and logic and smart should be on the plugin side, because what we're talking about really, in essence, is a client server architecture where the CO is the client, and the plugin is essentially a service provider.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, I would like to extend what Black said. Just one second. One second. I would like to extend what you said, especially on the NFS one. I was just thinking that if you have two NFS CSI drivers, how is it the CO is going to encode the name and IP or whatever it's going to do to be able to mount and unmount? It's almost like there needs to be a spec for the volume ID to be, unmarshaled, to be able to be absorbed by certain CSI drivers.
And that logic should not be in the CO.
Yeah, exactly. It just seems strange to me to be able to do that. I don't think that'll work, actually. So sorry.
That's what I was saying. We probably should have like some kind of pseudo ID that all volume plugin provider should represent a volume as some sort of ID string, and every additional smart to represent additional information should come somewhere else, whatever that's.
So the way the spec is today, a handle is a unique string plus a map of metadata, right? And that gives us that allows us to write, if the plugin provider chooses, it allows the plugin provider to put whatever information it needs to do stuff into that map of metadata and leave a simple string as the unique identifier. So my argument, and I'll make it again, is that there's a class of plugin for which this is good and useful. When I'm not saying that we don't have a class of plugin that's going to require backing stores and back channel communication between the various parts of the plugin, but I do think that there's, particularly for things like simple shared volume mounts, there's a class of plugin for which the node part of the plugin can be 50 lines of code. And one of our goals up front when we decided to create the CSI was to try to facilitate the easy creation of plugins. So if what we're saying is every plugin needs a back channel in order to get data between.
But it doesn't have to be a back channel, right? I mean, the plugin controls its destiny, so it could be a back channel, or it could be a.
But if we're saying that ID is just a string, and the CO is not going to pass any other data about the volume, and we're going to call the node plugin, and we're going to say publish, somehow the node plugin has to find out what that ID maps to, right? And remember, the node plugin is distributed onto every worker VM in the deployment. So there's a bunch of it, right?
Okay.
So,
Actually,
I still have
that's
to say,
what the metadata is for, is to get information over to the node plugin in the case where the node plugin is a simple process running on that worker with no database connection or anything.
So time check, we're coming up at the end of we are at overtime. Do you folks want to stick around for another 15 to 20 minutes to resolve this?
I can.
Sure.
Okay. All right.
Just
Yeah.
extending Vladimir's case, I'm looking at create volume request, for example, and if it's an NFS create volume, for example, which may or may not be able to, let's pretend it's a NetApp and it can. One of the things that I'm very concerned about is that map string to string is too generic. So, which is the same problem as the handle. The problem around I see is that there is no specification for NFS. For example, this is the IP, this is the name, this is the this is the name of the IP, this is the name of the service, this is the name for the mount points, right? So as a CSI driver developer, I know that this is the standard, so that I can just grab that information and then I know that's going to work across every CO. But right now, there is no such thing. We just have map string string. So the CO is going to put whatever they think it's going to go into that request. And then what's the driver going to do? It's going to have to then say, well, this CO can do this and that CO can do that. What I'm concerned with is, and this is just boiling down, is that we have to be very careful when we just say map string string metadata or map string string in a parameter. We have to be very concrete in the data that is being sent back and forth for a very specific type of volume being created. Because if not, the volume driver, the CSI driver is going to have to guess. And that's my concern.
It's going to have to guess regardless of whether it goes in the metadata map string to string or it gets encoded into the ID.
That's what I mean. And I just don't think that having a metadata, this kind of goes above what the discussion is right now.
Yeah, I think that's a valid concern, but I also think that it's out of scope for this meeting.
Yeah.
And it's something that we talked about, or like maybe, and we've seen other interfaces have ways of publishing the contract and the metadata they require. It's something we might consider embellishing CSI with. But I don't think we need to answer that in order to answer this.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that we're talking about NFS as an example, and then putting all the information in the volume ID. And that what I'm trying to say is that it's already a lost cause, because that would mean that would have to be unmarshaled. And how do you unmarshal that data?
You make the end user do it instead of the CO. CO can't do it, obviously. CO just exposes the dump fields, whether it's the string map to map or it's the actual ID. And then it's up to the cluster administrator or someone else to populate that data by looking at the volume plugin, looking at the formatting that's expected, and passing in that information.
So then, as a user, and I'm using Kubernetes and GKE, and then I would have to know what CSI driver I'm using so I can.
If you are doing pre-provisioning, so if you're doing dynamic provisioning, none of this matters to you. It's going to be invisible. If you're doing pre-provisioning, then you are explicitly asking for a specific volume type of a specific type. Then you are expected to know what the formatting for that volume type is.
So, so that means that there's a contract between the administrator and the CSI driver.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, all right.
So the contract actually is also true for pre-provisioned volumes, right? Because you need to the contract, right?
Exactly.
I have one question, like, correct my understanding, right? Let's say that if I have an NFS volume, so bear with me, let's assume that there is no create call, and I have a bunch of options.
Mm-hmm.
At the moment I do a node publish, I pass these options. Let's say these are the options which are sourced from CO with the user input. And you're doing a node publish, and the node publish response, you get a metadata response saying that, okay, this is how the the storage provider expects the information needs to be passed to the node. Okay, in the subsequent mount device calls, right?
In response to which call, sorry?
Mount device call. Let's say you have a mount device call.
Okay, for NFS?
Mount call or mount device, it's the same thing, right? Mount call.
Well, so mount, as the spec stands today, mount is node publish, right?
Okay.
I mean, that's where the mount happens, right? So we call create, we get back to metadata, we pass that to node publish, which is where the actual mount happens.
Mm-hmm.
Can't we just pass that information in that case just to the node publish in that for the NFS case? What are the
Yeah,
CO?
I think what we're saying is we can. The stickiness is that the plugin creators then have to advertise what format the volume handle should come in, like what's important to put in your volume handle in order to make it comprehensible to node publish, because the CO doesn't know about it. So then that becomes a contract between the plugin and the end user.
No, that is never inevitable, right? Because your source of information is coming from CO, and you are passing it to a create call. That means there is already a contract. How does moving that?
But the contract with the CO is you're going to give me a thing that you don't understand what it is, and I understand what it is, and I'm going to tell you an error if it's bad, right? I mean, that's the only contract with the CO. The CO is literally taking this thing from in that pre-provision case. The contract is just getting it from the CO is getting it from the end user and passing it to the plugin.
Even in this case, it's exactly the same, right? The CO is getting it, passing to the node publish.
Right.
How is it different?
But the CO doesn't know what it is.
In the primary case, in the first case, also CO doesn't know what it is, right? Even for the create call.
Right.
So how does it matter then? How is it different?
Sorry, so what's your point, Chakri? I'm not following.
So the point is, let's say that if you have a bunch of mount options, let's say NFS, and you don't have a create call, why can't that information be passed to the node publish?
It can, and that's kind of the way that we intend to do the pre-provision volumes.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what James is arguing for is there may be a set of information that is required for the node publish to be completed, and where does that come from?
So that's not the case for NFS, right? We are sticking with NFS right now.
So even for NFS, there's going to be fields that are required, like the export name, the IP address. Where should that information be exported? Or where should that information be stored or passed in?
That information is passed in from the CO, right? Because that information is exactly the same information you'll pass it to the create call.
Okay, but if it's passed into the 3.0, which field should it be passed in through?
So what are getting passed to the create call?
Today, the create call, so NFS wouldn't implement a create call. It doesn't really make...
Let's say it implements it. What will be the path?
Okay, so if you do implement it, what you would have to do is encode that. So there's two mechanisms on the create call. One is the name field. You could potentially encode it there if the volume plugin understands it. The other is an opaque map to map, which is essentially like the opaque storage class map to map parameters that we have today.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you were to implement an NFS volume plugin, you could encode that information there, but it kind of defeats the purpose of having a create call because it's not creating anything. You're saying, I have this thing, just give it back.
I kind of agree with it. It's a pseudo volume you're creating, right? But when you're publishing it, you're actually going to use the same map of string of string.
No, not necessarily. So imagine the map of string to strings that's passed in on create as a requirement list of what I want the volume to look like, not necessarily identifying information about it. So the way that it's intended to be used, the map of string to string on the create call is to say there's going to be arbitrary knobs when you're creating a volume, like whether you want SSD or spinning disk and all sorts of things like that. And so the storage plugin takes that information and it constructs a volume and it returns a handle which should be the primary, which should be the only thing that it requires on subsequent calls to be able to identify that volume.
Okay. So kind of the way I read it is then there are two arguments. One is a create argument and the other one is a publish argument.
Correct.
Publish arguments are the one which are published, which are given by the storage provider.
Which arguments are
the publish arguments, which are part of the volume ID, they're nothing but publish arguments or mount arguments, which are created by. There are create arguments which are given to you.
They're given as a response to the create volume call. And so potentially, if you don't do a create volume call, you could have your cluster administrator imitate what the create volume response would give you.
So that means that we have two arguments. One is the create arguments. For create calls, you'll give the create arguments.
Yep.
When you have a create arguments, actually the storage provider will give you the publish arguments, which you will use for the publish or the subsequent calls.
Right.
And it need not be a publish, just for the understanding sake, I'm saying it. So,
sure.
And the second one is, if somebody wants to directly bypass the create call, they will directly give a publish arguments.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So now that means that it cannot, the ID cannot be it's an ID plus an argument. So it has to be.
Yes, but why, right? Why not just ID?
The arguments cannot be ID, right?
Why not?
That means you have to encode all the arguments into only one single unique ID.
Right, but if your ID requires information beyond just itself, then it's not really an ID.
So that means that you have an ID, and then you're going to go back to the storage provider and ask that, give me the publish arguments for this volume.
No, I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're going to pass it as a string of map to map or just a single string. Ultimately, you have the same problem of like, either you have to ask the cluster administrator through the create volume call what those things are, or you come up with it, have the cluster administrator come up with it. Regardless of how you do it, you're either going to populate it into two fields. One is a string and a map, or you're going to populate it into, or you're going to encode it all into a single field.
If you encode it all into a single field, that means that the publish arguments are part of the same ID.
Publish arguments are part of the same ID.
So remember, like when you create,
I think what you're talking about is arguments that are not necessarily identity information, but are additional information that might be required on the.
Right.
So that kind of stuff, we have first-class fields to be able to pass that kind of information along. That includes whether the volume should be mounted as block or file, whether it's read-only, and additional information. We're going to add in mount options there, things like that. So those are going to be first-class fields. We don't have opaque parameters there because there's no need to have opaque parameters just for the attach call.
Let's say if I create NFS volume and I want all my volumes to have some mount options.
Yep.
Let's say on all of them.
There will be a mount options field that you can use.
Okay, and that will be part of the volume ID?
No, that's going to be separate from the volume ID because mount options are optional.'re not required to identify the volume.
Perfect, right? So that means that we already have a way by which we can pass the publish arguments.
That field doesn't exist. We need to add it, but that's okay. We're going to tackle that separately.
Okay, so that means that when you have a create volume call, you're already getting it a metadata, which is useful for the publish calls.
Yes.
But,
right?
But that's just for NFS, right? So like arbitrary parameters during create is not part of the mount options, obviously. Like either we add those into the.
Let's say we are calling it a mount options. Let's say let's call it a metadata, or let's call it a publish arguments, right? Whatever, or we can come up with a better name. But in the end, that is the arguments which we need to pass to the subsequent calls.
Yes.
We don't know the. I echo Julian's statement saying that like you don't want to pass all the arguments. Even today I have a confusion when I write a storage class. What are the parameters go to the create call and what are the parameters go to the mount call? The only way you can encode it is combine them together, all of them, right? So now the publish arguments, if the CO is going to return the how do you mount this volume, that will be the mount options or the publish arguments. Then we don't need to store the information in ID.
Yeah, actually, I would be that makes sense to me. So,
Julian, you see any issue with it?
I guess the only issue I can think of is essentially depending on whether the CO has a point for user interaction that's different at mount time. I mean, I think in Cloud Foundry, typically we would gather all this information up front anyway. because by the time we're starting the payload up, it's too late. Like we essentially create a storage. We create storage in a create service call, and we have a bind service where we associate it to the workload. But that happens well before any attach ever happens.
Yeah.
So those would end up being arguments to your bind service call. But that's kind of a Cloud Foundry specific thing, and it just means we have to gather the data up front and store it somewhere. I don't think it stops this mechanism from working. So
to summarize what Chakri is proposing, I think it's exactly what Julian proposed at the beginning of this call, except we're naming it something different, which is create volume returns to you two pieces of information. One is the ID, which contains all the information required to uniquely identify that volume, and it must be used on all subsequent requests, including publish, unpublish, and delete, to uniquely identify that volume. The second bit of information returned on the create volume call will be the publish info. Publish info is a map-to-map opaque, is an opaque map which could contain arbitrary information required for, not required, that can be used for, that must be passed on publish calls, but not on unpublish or delete calls. And the way that it would be used is that if a CO requires a particular volume that's created to be published in a specific way, it can pre-populate those fields, and the CO must pass those on subsequent publish calls. And if they don't, then the cluster administrator could potentially set those fields as a way to control the plugin. So either the CO could set it through the create volume response, or a cluster administrator could set it directly.
Yeah, so a bit of a naming issue, only because we've already got publish volume info that's returned from controller publish volume, and that's being passed into the node publish volume. But sorry, G, I interrupted you. You were gonna comment.
I'm just saying, like this sounds like the same as metadata, except that we don't pass the metadata in some certain cause.
Yeah, which is exactly what Julian was proposing at the beginning of this call. That's fine.
So there is only one issue which I still say it is, now this extra publish information is coming back to the CO. Does the CO guarantee to persist it?
CO has to, right? Otherwise, like, how do you pass that?
The CO has to pass it, but only on certain calls. It needs to pass it on publish calls only, not on delete calls, not on unpublished calls. And that would be okay. And the other thing is you cannot use this to, so this information will be accessible by the end user. So if it contains sensitive information, you need to be okay with having the end user have access to it. So you can't use it to store arbitrary secrets.
No, yeah,
I don't want the user to have access to.
Yep. Actually,
yeah. I think that's probably okay. I think maybe at some point in the future we might want a way for the create call to return a credential, but maybe we can kick that down the road.
Yeah.
And add it later. And just kind of we'll make sure we need it before we put it in.
Okay, so the last thing to decide then is the name of this thing. Are we going to keep it metadata, or are we going to call it publish arguments or something else? And to James' point, there's already a publish info that is returned from the controller publish and passed into the node publish. Would it make sense to collapse both of those into a single field and make it immutable, so that you could have it returned from create, passed in on controller publish, and then have it mutable so that the volume plugin can modify it, pass it back, and then, or do we want to keep it immutable throughout?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know what we're using the input to publish for right now. Like we have this opaque input to publish. Does anyone have a use case for that, or is that just the same thing that we're describing?
Well, it depends, right? If the attach like controller publish return like some like device path that you want to pass that device path to no publish, then that would be one use case I can think of. Although I don't know what that is, but that's potentially one thing. You do attach, you figure out like some storage system like figure out the device path after the device attach automatically, and that information needs to pass to no publish to the actual mount from that device to an actual mount point.
Sure. So essentially, we've got a set of data that's coming out of the create, right? Which is what we've been talking about.
Yep.
And then we've got an additional set of data that's potentially coming out of controller publish.
Right.
We could make the decision that we're going to layer those on top of each other, and in the CO, right? I mean, it's just a map.
Yeah, I was trying to avoid that. I mean, and then you have to define like, what if there's a conflict? What do you do? Like, do you like which value do you pick if there's a conflict? Kind of.
Well, yeah, presumably you would pick the one that came from the latest call, but maybe we just separate that out and say, forget that. We're not going to do that. We just pass both of these things to node publish. Yeah. And we just have to figure out a name for them. The
name is going to be, we want to name it in such a way that we reduce the cognitive overhead of what the heck they are and make it so that it's easy to understand. They're related but different at the same time. They're both arguments to the publish calls, but one is populated by the create response and the other is populated by the controller publish response.
Right. Yeah. Maybe we can take that offline. I mean, I don't. Okay. I'm not a huge fan of naming by committee, but I'm not likely to have a real strong opinion about that because naming isn't my thing that I get stuck on.
So it sounds like the only change is like don't consider the naming part. That the only change is like removing those things from those unnecessary calls like delete volume, unpublish volume. So
essentially we're going to take it out of handle, and we're going to return it separately, and then we're only going to pass it to publish calls.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. We're going to say that people shouldn't throw sensitive information in there.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be fine with that. That sounds like a good compromise, given people have different use cases.
Right. I think maybe we could strike a balance, and we should say that. Plugins shouldn't put critically sensitive information in there, and COs shouldn't log that information. So in other words, you don't have to encrypt it, but don't dump it in the log because it might be big and it might be whatever.
So Sam, I'm curious, like if that's the case, like how Kubernetes is going to adjust the API? Do you want to plan to add this publish info inside the PV, or there's some other ways you can do that?
Yeah, we would just have it exposed as part of the PV. It would just be a map.
String to string, and just don't call it metadata instead of calling like publish info, maybe.
We would have to I try to mirror whatever the internal name is, and that's why I want to. We should think about the name a little more. We can do that offline. I would like the naming to align with what we have for publish info because it's related. I guess maybe publish info and create info.
Well, you can always call the original publish info like controller publish info.
Controller publish info and then create publish info.
Yeah, something like this. Just it's kind of a little weird. Let's figure it out.
Somebody needs to think about this in the context of not a meeting and come up with a.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we've come to a conclusion then. Who wants to take up the task of writing this up and sending out a PR?
I'm happy to send out a PR.
Awesome. Thank you, James.
Excellent. Thank you.
Can you quickly summarize on the associated bug as well, what we closed on here?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Cool. All right. Thanks a lot.
Yep.
All right. Thanks, guys.
All right, take care, everyone. Thanks for putting up with this. Sorry, Julian, I don't mean to like harass you. This was just it was fun. It was worth sorting out.
Okay, very good. I think we ended up in an okay place. So that's
Awesome.
cool.
Good.
All right, thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.